point of view, just to kind of set the container for our time together. So these are some agreements that I've come up with. If there are other ones that you're like, oh, let's be mindful of this, please feel free to add them in the chat. The first is, might seem obvious, this is not counseling. So just briefly, I am a licensed professional counselor. I have a private practice that was originally based in Golden before the pandemic. It's been all telehealth since then. And I've really integrated a lot of experiential. I have training in somatic therapies, and I have training in nature-based therapies. My predominant training for couples-specific therapy is RLT, or relational life therapy, which integrates feminist theory, family systems, and Terry Real was trained under Pia Melody, so there's a lot of kind of influence from the addiction and recovery world in his model as well. So that's a little bit about that. If you have questions, let me know. But in general, I just really want to talk about this topic. So, but before we get to that, let's continue with the agreements. The other piece I'm going to invite you to bring is an adventure mindset. So this is something I bring to my clients and when I give presentations. And from my point of view, an adventure mindset is being open to what could unfold, being willing to take a level of risk with the opportunity to learn and connect. You know, the thing about it, from my point of view, that makes an adventure is this sense of aliveness when we're exposed in some way to a level of vulnerability. And when we can do so in a group that we feel supported by, we can have a sense of feeling safe enough. Because learning really takes place when we're not in our space of comfort, right? I had a professor who would say, if you're comfortable, you're not growing. And I think there's some truth to that. And so what can we create that helps us to stay grounded? I mean, for myself, I have tea, I have a candle, I'm barefoot, like I'm doing all these things to help me stay grounded so I can be as present as possible. Because weirdly enough, I felt imposter syndrome about giving a presentation about imposter syndrome. So it's definitely still present. The other piece that I want to encourage is the past role. So I'm going to invite us to do activities and visualizations. If at any point that doesn't really, you don't feel like that's going to help you feel safe enough in this space, feel free to pass. And you can also always turn off your screen because we do get a lot of screen time, and that can be a way of taking care of ourselves. So these are all the things I go over with my clients. Don't wait until the last minute to go to the bathroom, because then your focus isn't on the presentation or each other, you know. Have snacks, water, turn off your screen, etc. And then our agenda. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what imposter syndrome is from my point of view. Is imposter syndrome similar to narcissism? It could have some roots, I guess. I'd be curious what other people, I haven't looked into that, but I'd be curious with the group if the question is imposter syndrome similar to narcissism? I didn't necessarily come across that, but I'd be curious about what the group has to say. I could see somebody who is dealing with narcissism being susceptible to this experience of imposter phenomenon, but I don't have any data on that. And go ahead, did somebody have something to share? Okay, so then we're also going to talk about the impact on the nervous system, do an activity, and discuss managing our energy and resources, and then how to shift our nervous system. So that's kind of just a game plan of what to expect. And so before we get started, because I'm sure you guys are doing things before you got on, and you're probably thinking about what you're going to do after. I'm very much about like getting us in the moment and really connecting with the present. Ooh, I think somebody, if you could mute yourself. Somebody's logged on. I don't know who it is. Okay, that's better. Thank you. So yes, I'm going to go ahead and lead us in 3 deep breaths. And the exercise I've chosen to do is a cleansing breath from yoga. So you can choose to close your eyes. You can look at this beautiful picture of a sunset in Santa Fe. Whatever feels good. But I'm just going to go ahead and lead us in a cleansing breath. Is a breath in through the nose, and then an exhale out through the mouth. And if you make an audible sigh, that can feel really good. And I'm just going to invite us to get inside our bodies and slow down and be present, so you can really take in and be on this adventure with me. So like I said, if you want to close your eyes, I'm going to lead us. So breathing in through the nose and filling your chest and your stomach, and then breathing out through the mouth. And breathing in again through the nose and filling your stomach and chest, and breathing out through the mouth. And one more time, breathing in through the nose and filling everything up as much as possible, and then sighing it out. And if you just want to do a gentle scan, just checking in with what you notice in the body. And I'm going to continue us on to just give us a little data about what I've learned about imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome. One being that those names are used interchangeably. So originally, the research was done by Drs. Pauline Rose Clamps and Dr. Suzanne Imes. During the 70s is when their original paper was published. And they coined the term imposter phenomenon. And the field and research since then kind of goes back and forth between phenomenon and syndrome. That's kind of, yeah, I didn't see really any big difference about those two words. And some characteristics based off the research, and there has been multiple studies done since then. And in fact, I created like kind of a list of resources that I gave Bree to share with anyone who's interested in receiving. One of the resources that I listed was Dr. Diva Chakravarti, who is based in a school in India, and I actually did a kind of presentation with her, and she presented her research on how imposter phenomenon shows up, particularly in STEM, and how it impacts women and people of color more than other people who were done, in the study. And that's kind of what Drs. Pauline Rose Clamps and Dr. Imes found originally was, in studies that have repeated, that a lot of times it impacts women and those that are in the world at large. Some components or characteristics need to know every piece of information, and it's not just for the sake of like, oh, I just really want this from a few kind of anxiety. That's one of the imposter is underlying anxiety, a feeling of doubt. It's been called the syndrome of feeling like a fraud, feeling like you don't belong. And because of that underlying anxiety and doubt, often people who are impacted by this phenomenon are constantly seeking new trainings and certifications. This really applies to me when I read this. I was like, oh yes, I've done this. There's a sense that any mistake is a failure. And this really stands out to me because in our field, we have a big impact on people's lives. So there's this, noticeable pressure to be mindful of that influence and impact and be mindful of ethics. And that seems important to me, but this is like taking it to the next step of always questioning what you're doing. And when you show up as a human and you make a mistake, that there's this obsessive rumination that can take place, and not really internalizing your sense of mastery. So what I thought when I was thinking about this presentation, I reflected on something that Terry Real shared. A new student had asked Terry, when will I get to the place when I go into a room to meet with a couple, I'm not afraid anymore? Because I think she was thinking like, then I'll feel a sense of mastery. And he was like, well, I haven't gotten to that place. And I was like, oh, dang, not promising. And, he talked about, that it's reasonable to have a level of concern or awareness, or really feeling the gravity of having people's lives and well-being in our hands, and being connected with that. And then what he talked about was that is probably always going to be present. We want that to be present because we're much less likely to commit an ethical error. The challenge is when that like dominates our experience, when our physiology becomes hijacked by the anxiety. And then we're making choices not from creativity, not from our sense of mastery, but we're making choices from a place of fear. And so that's really what imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome really is from my point of view. It's this place of fear and anxiety, of doubt, and we're not confident in our abilities. And because of that, we can feel stressed out when we're not accomplishing something. And there's this sense of we can't know enough, we're never enough. It doesn't matter if our peers have recognized us as having a sense of mastery, we have not internalized this. And what's really interesting about imposter phenomenon is the types of people who have it are all kinds of people. That's why I like this meme. It says the types of people who have imposter syndrome, all the smart, successful people you think have their shit together. And many successful people have come out and shared that this is something that has impacted them. Former First Lady Michelle Obama wrote about it in her book. Sheryl Sandberg has talked about it. I just gave another example of Terry Real talking about how he's had 25 years working intensely with couples and he still experiences a level of like unease. Maya Angelou has also talked about it, and just many people have come out, and even if they've had success in the public's eyes or amongst their peers, they're still feeling like they're not measuring up. So it's definitely not something that's probably going to go away. And this presentation is really about how do we move beyond it? How do we recognize what it is and work with it? And so I learned a lot of these kind of stats, and I knew about it in the head, but the challenge was I hadn't worked with it in the body. And that's what I think is the big challenge here. What makes it difficult to move beyond it is that if we often try to think our way out of the issue, and it's a response that it exists in our nervous system. It's a knee-jerk physiological response to feelings of doubt, worry, anxiety, fear, criticism, perceived criticism. As I mentioned, this often, unfortunately, significantly can impact people of color and those that identify with groups that are oppressed in our culture. And so microaggressions can trigger this knee-jerk response, and then flat out macro aggressions. And just being in this culture can be triggering for many people. And so doesn't even take into account if you have a trauma history, that can also impact your physiology, obviously. And so imposter phenomenon can be something that is more triggering if you have a nervous system that's more sensitive to these inner states of anxiety and fear and criticism. And so to really work with it, we have to work with the nervous system from my point of view and be aware of what it feels like in the nervous system, and then also work to increase our resiliency, our sense of belonging, and build those neural pathways where we can feel more empowered and grounded, so that even if something triggers the imposter phenomenon, we don't get hijacked by that trigger. So I'm gonna pause there because that's a lot of information, and just see if there's any questions. And then if there are, please put them in the chat. And Bree, my chat went away, so if there are questions, will you let me know?
Yeah, I can read them out loud to you.
Cool. Okay, so I'm just briefly going to talk about the autonomic nervous system, because from my point of view, this is a big component of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the nervous system and the imposter syndrome kind of hijacking the experience. And so this is a summarized version for those of you on this call. I'm sure there are many people who have studied this in deeper depth, and if you would like to add to the conversation, I encourage you to do so. I'm just going to give a brief overview, talking about kind of the two components at play when we're talking about the knee-jerk physiological response, and that's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system, very simply, is typically our activating system, and it often shows up when we're feeling fight, we go into fight, flight, freeze when the environment or internal experience is feeling threatening. And it's not conscious. A lot of times my clients are like, well, why did I go into fight, flight, freeze? It doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, well, it's not the rational part of our brain that is taking in this data and determining threat, right? So it evolved, we evolved bottom up. And so when we're talking about these two systems, we're really talking about systems that are below our conscious awareness, that are constantly scanning the environment for potential threats. And a lot of us in the current environment might have a more sensitive sympathetic nervous system, especially if you've experienced trauma and you acknowledge, are aware of that and connected with that. So, but that can be the same actually with the parasympathetic nervous system. So that part of the system is called the rest and digest system, or is referred to that. And both systems ideally are in a rhythm, right? So it's helpful that our sympathetic nervous system kick into gear when we wake up in the morning, and that we have some adrenaline and a little bit of cortisol to get us moving. Otherwise, we just stay in bed. But I believe our culture really kind of promotes us being constantly activated and producing and doing, and doesn't really emphasize the parasympathetic nervous system. So I'm hearing some music. If somebody could mute themselves, that'd be great. Although I love music. And then, so the parasympathetic nervous system, a lot of times in our culture, doesn't kick in till it has to. So we're so, in this state of more activation that at some point, we can only exhale for so long before we have to inhale, before the body has to slow down. And from my point of view, a lot of us in our day-to-day schedules are very out of balance, where our sympathetic nervous system is definitely more on edge, it's more activated, and we're not necessarily intentionally putting rest into our day where we really mindfully engage with the parasympathetic nervous system. And coming from a family where workaholism was not considered a problem, this is something I've really had to work on, and it's something I work a lot with my clients on, especially if they come from families where napping was considered a weakness, and rest wasn't something that was really encouraged and supported. And I would definitely say, that's not a part of our culture, right? Like, our focus is always on growth and what's the next level, and there isn't really a celebration of endings and slowing down, although COVID has shifted some of that. So this is at play. This sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, both those systems are at play when we're talking about the imposter syndrome. And from my point of view, for a lot of people, their nervous system's taking in information, and if somebody criticizes them or they don't feel sure of themselves, they are more likely probably to have their sympathetic nervous system activated. If they tend to be a fighter or a fleer, but if they're more of a freeze type of person, it's potentially that the parasympathetic nervous system's kicking in, right? So just kind of depends. Okay, so I think, yes, we're ready for an activity. So I'm going to go ahead and lead us in a guided visualization. I have a little video, so if you don't want to close your eyes or you tend to get distracted, it's a way to kind of get focused as I lead you through a story. And for anyone else, I'm going to invite you to go ahead and close your eyes. You can turn off your screen. It's going to be about 5 to 7 minutes long, just to prepare you for that. So go ahead and get comfortable. We're going to start with a body scan, and then I'm going to lead you in a story. So it's going to be like in kindergarten where they used to tell us stories. I love that part. So I'm going to go ahead and play the video if that feels comfortable. And then for those of you that have closed their eyes, I'm going to invite us to again connect with the breath. And just noticing the inhale and the exhale. And if your eyes close or go soft, do what feels comfortable to you. And I'm just going to lead us in a gentle body scan. So starting at the top of the head, noticing any sensation there. And bringing your awareness to your face and your forehead. Awareness to the back of the head and neck. And bringing awareness to your throat and vocal cords. Bringing your awareness to your heartbeat and tuning into its rhythm as it pumps and circulates blood throughout the body, bringing ongoing renewal and life. And then I'm going to invite us to connect with the base of our neck all the way down to the base of the spinal cord. And just noticing this information highway with lots and lots of nerves and data about how our body is experiencing the present moment. And then bring your awareness back to your chest and your ribs, your digestive system. And just noticing as sensation comes and goes. And when your mind wanders, just gently invite it back into the body. And then bringing awareness to your pelvic bowl, which holds all your major organs, a very important part of our stabilization and balance in the world. Connecting with your energetic core, wherever you can find that. And noticing that. Bringing awareness to your glutes and your hips, working your way down your legs to the tops of your feet and the bottoms of your feet. And then just holding your whole body in your awareness. And again, when your mind wanders, gently bring it back to the body and just noticing what's happening in the present moment. And then in your mind's eye, I'm going to invite you to go on an adventure with me. So bring to mind that we are going to go on a mountain biking adventure, even if you don't mountain bike. We're going to use our imaginations. So imagine that you are in Northwest Montana and you and your riding partner have decided to do this high alpine trail. You get up way in the mountains. And you have all the gear you need. You've spent a lot of time on your bike, so you know that you can do it. And at the same time, you're feeling slightly intimidated. So you're feeling that in the body while you're also feeling the part of you that knows that you have a level of mastery and competency. So noticing how that activation, that sense of unease, are you really prepared to handle what you're about to encounter? And notice where that's in the body. And then really notice where you feel that empowerment, that confidence, that sense of I can take on what's going to happen, that resiliency. And just notice where those parts are in the body, how they interact or don't. And now you're on your bike and you're following your riding partner. And it's pretty narrow single track and you're going along and you're taking in the scene. There's a lot of uphill. And as you're going along, your heart is beating as you're doing this active activity. And at some point, it dawns on you that you are very much out in the wilderness. To the right of you, there is almost 1 million acres of wilderness. And you are not seeing any signs of humans. And so the survival part of you is starting to be a little more vocal. And you can notice that doubt is maybe creeping in a little bit more and unease is creeping in a little bit more. And then you remember you're in Northwest Montana where there are grizzlies. So that's going around in your brain. And still there's a part of you that wants to remain grounded and present and take in the beauty and the majesty of where you are. And those two parts are kind of going back and forth as you're climbing up this rocky mountain. And at some point, you separate from your partner for about 30 minutes. And during that time, you're in a section where you have to hike your bike up. It's rocky, you're falling, and you notice the part of you that does not feel confident, does not feel sure of itself, is starting to get louder and louder and more pronounced. And you're noticing the heart rate is increasing and your stomach isn't settled and you're sweating more. A, because you're pushing a bike up, and B, because there's fear and anxiety is starting to be more present. And it's harder and harder for you to connect with that part of you that was really encouraging you to be present, really excited about the adventure. And after about a half an hour, you get to the top of this hill and you see your partner. And they immediately give you a Cliff Bar. And you start eating that, and the parasympathetic nervous system starts to kick in. You take some deep breaths, and they talk with you. And they say, hey, it looks like you're not super stoked. What's going on? You explain, well, I was just worried about the grizzly bears, and I'm worried about the trail. And they don't downplay that. They're like, yeah, I can understand that. And they encourage you. They offer you support. They say, hey, you got this. Like, we've done this before. We have all the skills and the tools. And we are on this journey together. We may be on separate bikes. And so there's part of it that is up to us. And we're a team, and we're going to get through this. And that support and that encouragement really helps to temper what was hard to temper. And you notice the part of you that was more present and more grounded is able to work with that part that was feeling like an imposter, like they didn't belong. And as the ride continues, that support, that sense of team really brings out that part of really being present. And the ride becomes more and more fun. You're able to be more and more present and take in just the tremendous wilderness and beauty. And by the end of the trail, you're just so stoked going down on virgin single track and having a great time. And when you get down to the bottom, you check back in with your riding partner and really talk about how awesome that adventure was and how much resiliency and strength you both had to make it through. And that's the end of my story. So I'm going to go ahead and invite you to just kind of check in with the body and notice what came up as you went on this journey, what's showing up for you. And I'm going to go ahead and invite you to open up slido.com as you come back and transition back in. And if you could offer up, when you go to slido.com, type in this code 68284. And hopefully it works this time. And share one word or short phrase to describe what it was like being on this journey with your riding partner. Exciting. Oh, yes, it's working. Restless at times, relaxing at times, challenging. Calming. Relaxing break. Very nice. Exciting. So what's cool about this is the more predominant word is what gets bigger. So for a lot of you, experience exciting, centering, great, hopeful, fulfilling, victory. Give us kind of 30 more seconds and then we can continue on. Peace. I miss the peacefulness of wilderness. Oh, yes. We were talking about that earlier. Sweet. All right, so unsettling, yes. So kind of the gamut, and that's hopefully what I was trying to bring up in this story. So, you know, being able to name what's happening. And as I often share with my clients, the survival part of us is really important. We're not trying to get rid of it. And so how can we work with it? And so this is actually on this ride that I was talking about. And you know, there could be a fear of grizzly bears. I mean, that's a legitimate fear, I think. And how can you work with it, right? And so one of the things that I really like about this story is that it captures a few different things. One, that there's kind of these different parts of ourselves and how can we be mindful of them and work with them. And the other piece of how important support is. That's really what helped, you know, the main character get out of that anxiety, or myself, is that support of being like, yeah, we have this. And that's why it's so important from my point of view for us to have trusted peers in the work we do. Because working with people and working, a lot of us see people at their most vulnerable, and that can be hard on the heart, and it can help. I mean, it's not weird to feel overwhelmed by the sense of hopelessness that can walk into our door, because we are human. And so how can we be connected with each other so we have that support? So like in the story, you might be out on your own mountain bike, or, you know, your own private practice, or, you know, you might be out connecting with community members on your own, so to speak. And it's so important to know that you really are a part of a team, and to be able to call people. I mean, consultation has been such a big part of me feeling comfortable in private practice, because I experienced a ton of imposter syndrome when I opened my own practice. I remember being like, oh yeah, I feel I'm getting this counseling thing when I worked at other agencies. And then when I opened my private practice, I was like, I don't know anything. It feels a little extreme. And that can happen when these things hijack us. And so it can be so helpful to just name where we can feel this, and then where we maybe are less susceptible. I realized in doing this presentation that I experienced imposter syndrome in doing the outdoor sports that I love. And I wasn't even really aware of it until I started putting this together. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I get the sense that I don't belong, and I shouldn't be out on the trail like all the time, especially when I know it's going to be a difficult event that I'm doing, or a difficult trail. And so a lot of the same skills are transferable. And it's the same when we're having difficult conversations with family members, or when we're working with clients on challenging things. We can feel imposter syndrome in any of those spaces, and those same skills, from my point of view, can be brought to any of those arenas. So it's just so helpful to know where that might show up, and then how to be prepared so we can transform the experience. The other piece that I brought up in my last presentation, if you attended, was this concept of our life bar. And so when I was pretty early on into being a counselor, I worked a lot and worked for an agency that expected me to work long hours. And that was challenging, because I remember in grad school, they're like, self-care is so important. And then I found myself in a lot of spaces where they may have promoted that and they didn't live it. And so I went and sought specifically a somatic-based counselor to work with me on how to just become more knowledge of my somatic experience, and also how to manage my energy, because I found myself going, and then crashing. And it was a pattern I had repeated throughout my life. Like when many of you might remember when you were in school, people often get sick during finals week. And a big part of that is, right, their sympathetic nervous system is so engaged, they're exhaling, and then they eventually have to inhale, and their immune system crashes. And that is not a great rhythm from my point of view. And I remember talking to this counselor and being like, I don't like this. And she's like, well, Melissa, practice doesn't make perfect, it makes permanent. What you are practicing day to day is your life, is your habits. And I was like, well, these are terrible habits, because my energy is depleted by the weekend. And so we really worked on how to be mindful of my life energy throughout the day, and really focus, hour by hour and throughout the day on where my life bar energy is. And I get the concept from life bars from video games. For anyone who's ever played or seen somebody play video games, there's usually a life bar for your character. And throughout the game, there are things that increase and decrease your energy. And this is how I approach thinking about my day. What do I need? Where am I at? And checking in on all the different levels of health, my emotional health, my mental health, my physical health, my spiritual health, my sexual health, my relational health. It's a lot. So I try to just think about it big picture and be mindful of the activities that help me increase my energy and can increase my energy in multiple areas of health, which really can boost that life bar. So my invitation to you is to think about, I have a lot of clients do this, to think about what manages, what helps increase their energy and what decreases their energy. Because for a lot of my couples, by the time they see each other in the evening, their life bar is like pretty much depleted. And then the video game, it's like the flashing red zone, which means you're about to die. And that's usually when they want to have an emotional conversation about their relationship, because that's when they have time. And then it doesn't go well because their life bar energy isn't from a place of abundance. It's like almost to the point of full depletion. So I work a lot with them on being mindful of their life bar energy and then knowing where they're at when they do approach their partner and seeing where their partner's at. Because if one person's abundant and the other person's pretty low, it's going to be difficult to have a meaningful conversation. And the other reason I bring this up related to imposter phenomenon is, from my point of view, we are much more likely to have our nervous system hijacked if we're feeling depleted. So one of the ways to really move beyond and increase our resiliency to imposter syndrome is to manage this life bar energy. Because if our nervous system and our whole biome is feeling very lively and abundant and full of energy, and somebody says something, we're much more likely to perceive that from a place of the most generous interpretation. That's something Brene Brown talks about in building trust in relationships, right? Is being able to be generous with how people say things. Well, if we're feeling depleted and they say something to us, it's very hard to be generous because we don't have the extra energy for that empathy and compassion. And so this is so huge in terms of our work with others and then just how we show up in life. Another component kind of related to this is another thing that I've seen in terms of my own sensitivity to imposter syndrome is how well I'm living out my priorities, meaning my time and energy is aligned with what I consider to be the most important. And I see this also with my clients. So when they tell me, God's my most important, or my partner's my most important, and then they list, what's important, and then we determine, where they're putting their time and energy. A lot of times, if they're feeling out of sorts or like things are not where they need to be, it's because there's a misalignment. Like energy and time is going to things that are much less important, much less priority to them. And so one of the ways that we can feel, again, sensitive to criticism or our own feelings of doubt is when we're out of alignment with what's most important to us. So a way to determine this, or one of the ways that I've worked with clients, is to have them create a pie chart. And so I did this for myself. What are the things that are most important to me? And then I determined on a weekly basis, basically, where I put my time and energy. And then I can determine, like, do I need to increase or decrease, or how can I allocate that? And there's some things that aren't going to be able to give. I have a lot of clients that are like, well, I'm the, primary financial provider. And while work is not entirely important to me, I still have to do it. And so we talk about, like, where can they incrementally shift some energy or shift some of their mental space? A lot of people think about work when they're not at work. And so how can they fully disengage from their work so that the things that are important to them, they can fully engage with? Some other tools to think about. And then the other piece that I didn't lead with is, from my point of view, this discussion of imposter syndrome and imposter phenomenon is really a discussion, or it can be a discussion about social justice issues. So because it tends to impact women and people of color more, and other people who don't feel like they belong in our culture, from my point of view, combating imposter syndrome by engaging in self-care, by taking care of our life bar, is kind of an FU to the system, is how I see it. Like, it's a way to dismantle these systems of oppression. And so when we do these things for ourselves, not only is it good for us and we're going to be able to be more effective in the work we do, we really are helping to dismantle systems that are really oppressive to all. And so I see it as an act of rebellion. The last kind of piece I want to just briefly touch on is I've been doing a lot of deeper work about like, why does this happen? And as I may have mentioned, one of my mentors is trained in feminist theory. And I've looked kind of just generally speaking at what throughout the ages has been assigned to masculine and feminine energy. So less about gender and more about human characteristics and how they've been divided into these binary. And in a patriarchal culture, we tend to value what is the masculine energy that's linear and rational and giving and structured and all these things. And the things that can really bring us into balance is when we can tap into this feminine energy of receiving, of being receptive and the collective energy and surrendering and the creative flow. And the more we're in harmony with both those energies, the more integrated we are. And again, it's just another aspect of the self-care. And what I realized is with most of my clients, they feel way more comfortable with giving than they do receiving. And I would have included myself in this. I've done a lot of work, so I feel more comfortable in this, but there's definitely this sense that it's easier to give our time and energy and gifts than it is to receive that same care, that same nurturing, that same compassion. And it makes sense to me because if we're in a patriarchal culture that values the masculine energy, then the receiving aspect of receiving love and nurturing for ourselves can feel selfish and we get all these negative messages. So again, it's just another way to be mindful that when we can both give and receive to ourselves, we're more integrated and we're really bringing integration into the world, which again, from my point of view, is a social justice component, and it's important work. So you may feel like self-care is like there's no time for it, but there's all these reasons of how you're really contributing to the collective. The more integrated you are, the more you're able to bring your talents forth and your gifts. So it's really good stuff. So the last thing I want to bring us to is just thinking about what brings you joy and pleasure and bringing that to your life bar energy. So these are all things on my screen that are things that bring me joy. Just looking at these pictures brings me joy. So I'm going to invite you to think about that throughout your day. How do you not only bring things into your life that bring you joy, but really savor it and really feel it in the body? Because as Adrienne Maree Brown, who wrote Pleasure, Activism, and the Emergent Strategy, says, there is no way to repress pleasure and expect liberation, satisfaction, or joy. And that is why I think self-care is an act of, is a revolutionary act. And it really can help us bring a lot of the goals we have of more peace and harmony and connection, and really allowing all people's talents and gifts to be shared with the world, because we're facing some big challenges, and I believe we need everyone's gifts to be able to fully show up and connect with everybody else. So that is all I have. Here's my info.
I have a couple comments that I just want to read to you here. So
Yes.
Allison Feeney said that you may be interested in work done by the NAP ministry. You can find them on Instagram. They promote rest as an equity and social justice.
Ooh, I love that. I'm writing that down. And who was that shared that?
Allison Feeney.
Okay, thank you, Allison.
And then David shared that it's relieving to hear that some people who have imposter syndrome don't feel like they have enough trainings or certifications. I think this is seen with the latest push for DBT and EMDR. The thought is if you aren't certified in these, that a counselor hasn't arrived, isn't proficient, or isn't as proficient as we could be.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thanks, David. Yes, I think that's the challenge, right? Like, how do we stay current and then not also feel like we have to take every single training, because we're going to spread ourselves thin and we can't really develop a niche of expertise. So that's a really great point. Thank you.
Yeah. And then one more comment just by Yosef, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing. The most difficult normally is being generous to the self.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Definitely.
It's huge. This is why, yeah, it's a really great point. It is a big challenge. So Bree, will you go ahead and stop the recording and then we can open it up for questions?